Thank you for joining us for another CECL webinar from Ardmore Advisors. This latest presentation in our series will focus on some of the lessons learned as some financial institutions have begun their mandated parallel runs as they ramp up for CECL implementation next year. During today's presentation, please feel free to use the question box on the right side of your screen to request any information that might not be mentioned. We will try to leave time at the end of the program to answer any questions that come in. In addition, we will be referencing Ardmore's data assessment capabilities and the credit portfolio management suite that we have developed in partnership with Argus Information Systems. Additional information about those offerings can be found in the Handouts tab on the right side of your screen. Now it is my pleasure to turn the program over to our presenter, Peter Cherpack. Peter is an Executive Vice President and Partner at Ardmore Banking Advisors and has been a featured speaker for organizations including the Risk Management Association, the American Bankers Association, and the Conference of State Bank Supervisors. He has also been published in the American Banker, the RMA Journal, and various other industry publications. Peter?
Thanks, Matt. And thanks, everyone, for joining me this afternoon. We're pretty excited about this presentation because it's something we've been working on for quite a while to get to the point where we could actually share with our audience some best practices that are emerging for community banks around the CECL calculation. There's a lot of discussion of large bank models and how the big banks are handling CECL with all sorts of sophisticated capabilities. It's nice that we can now share a little bit about how the community banks are dealing with this problem. So let me get started. And first, quick advertisement for Ardmore, if you're not familiar with us. Sorry. We're a full service risk management firm for credit risk analysis. And we've been around for over 25 years, helping community banks with their credit issues. And we've also been working on automating credit solutions such as stress testing, portfolio analytics, and CECL now, helping community banks move from spreadsheets to systems to make them more efficient and cost effective, as well as secure. We are partners with Argus. We're also partners with various core systems. Argus Information Systems are the vendor of CECL software that we partnered with and helped develop the CECL solution that we'll talk about at the end of this presentation. Argus is located in White Plains, New York. Has been around for 20 years, mostly doing data benchmarking and compliance systems for banks of all sizes. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the emerging best practices for CECL calculations. Before we do that, we like to do a poll. We find that polls are great because they help give us context about who's listening and also can help us tune our responses to you. So we really appreciate you participating in that. And the first poll is really an asset size poll. We simply do this so that when we reflect upon other answers, we get a sense of who our audience is and who's listening, as well as, puts in context the kinds of solutions that we can deliver. Ardmore, as well as some of our partners in other industry groups like RMA, really want to deliver good content to our prospects and clients. So the more we know about who's listening, the better. All right, we're going to close this down in a second and show you the results. Thank you for participating. Okay, and you can see that the majority of the banks attending here are 1 to 5 billion, and there's a good representation from the less than 500 million as well. So thanks for that. And just to piggyback on that poll, we'll do one more, and then we'll get into the content. And this is really a question about where you are right now on your CECL journey. Banks are in different places dealing with different issues. So again, appreciate your participation in the poll. Just to give an idea, I know one of these answers may not be exactly perfect, but as close as possible where you are on the journey. We're seeing banks of all sizes in all different status as far as where they're going, if they're still planning, if they're setting up relationships with vendors to support them, or whether or not they're just doing data remediation or other early steps. So Okay, we got a couple more votes to go, and it looks like we're just about all in. Thank you again for participating. We appreciate it, and we'll share those results with you now. Okay, and you can see that the vast majority are working with vendors now on their CECL journey, and those are probably the ones that are the larger institutions. And then kind of a pretty even split amongst those that are planning, looking at automated solutions and data collection, and a few that haven't started yet, probably the 2022 banks. So thank you. Okay, so let's talk about what we're doing and what we're learning. So we do have a number of banks that have purchased our automated solution. And for those banks, we are now running the models and seeing how the data works with the different models and what the variables are. We're looking at the different calculations and the components of the calculations to figure out what can make a stable and reasonable ACL or reserve under CECL. In particular, what we're trying to do is figure out what are the different variables that we can change and how do they affect the calculation and how can they potentially improve and create a more stable and reasonable number. The only way to do this really is to run your data through the models. So that's what we're working on. All right, so we all know there are several different methodologies that are considered reasonable. Some of them are listed up here on the right. There is no one endorsed method. The most commonly used methods for community banks are vintage and cohort. Cohort is also sometimes called snapshot because those are most similar to the way the ACCL is done today. Another model, which is the weighted average remaining maturity model, or WARM, is considered by the agencies to be a valid starting point for CECL, though it is not considered a risk-based solution. Also, we found that WARM was criticized by a number of the accounting firms and some of the industry leaders like the American Bankers Association. So we decided that we'll focus this conversation on how vintage and cohort are affected by different variables in the calculation and what best practices could be evolving. Okay, so the CECL recipe, when we started out, what we were told in 2017 and 2016 was that basically, if you follow the methodologies for CECL that have been laid out, the calculations, doing either vintage or cohort or PD/LGD or one of these other methods, that basically if you did it right, most of the variables in the economy, in the bank's portfolio, will be baked into the calculation. So there probably won't need many Q factors because if you do the calculation right and follow the models, things like economic condition and portfolio mix will be built in. But what has happened over the last several years as we've been talking with regulators as they've done their webinars and audit firms, it seems more like now we're getting the impression that the calculation is really just part of the ACL estimate. And the fact is that due to the lack of good quality economic and portfolio data over a long period of time, the fact that there are very sporadic losses in most community banks' portfolios over time, and the fact that estimating the future is not as simple as following one of these models would suggest, we're hearing now that it's going to be a lot more Q factors going on. And in fact, it's possible that the calculation itself will just be a guideline. So let's see why this might be. Let's start talking about the first factor, which is what we call subpooling. Subpooling is something that was talked about in the beginning as a likely scenario for a community bank, which is that their current ACCL pools wouldn't really translate to CECL well. So what we did was we started with the idea that you would want to keep your current CECL estimates, because that way, your current pooling for CECL, because that way you can look at your loss history a lot more directly because you've already got it calculated that way. What we found is you can make sub-pools within those pools that make the calculations more accurate and consistent. So a sub-pool would be within, say, an asset-based pool like 5+ family. You might be breaking that out into sub-pools based on risk characteristics. These are the characteristics that we were told repeatedly are things that you needed to capture in your history. So for example, for vintage, the vintage calculation, sub-pools broken out by term or tenor band worked well, because what it would do is it would not unfairly penalize the short-term or short-tenored assets by giving them loss rates of the long-tenored assets, and vice versa. So by isolating into sub-pools based on term, we're able to get a more accurate and reasonable calculation. For cohort or snapshots, it's similar, except that here, because of the fact that tenor isn't as important, we're breaking out the asset pools using risk characteristics. Typically, an internal risk rating works very well. I say typically because in some cases, some particularly smaller community banks don't use risk ratings throughout their portfolio, or their risk ratings are highly concentrated, meaning that there really wouldn't be much value in creating subpools. But these are some ideas that we can look at and try, and this is what we tried when we were running our models. So here would be some examples of a vintage subpool. Now you might say, what logic do you use to create these pools? We'll talk about that in a moment, but just at a high level, obviously you're not going to create any pools that have a longer tenor than your longest tenored loan within the asset class. And obviously you're not going to create sub-pools that are going to be empty because there'll be no ACL calculated. So you have to do some real analysis of your portfolio. This is where either you can do this yourself using internal reports that break out your portfolio by tenor, or if you use programs like the Argus program that we work with, they have reports that come out that show you this. Cohort subpools similarly would look like this. And again, we're not looking at every individual risk rating because some of the risk ratings would probably be empty or would have no losses. And that's another factor when creating your subpools is, are there losses? You don't want to create losses, but on the other hand, calculating a CECL calculation without any losses in the subpool is a problem. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. Let's talk about subpooling. As I mentioned, the number of subpools is based on the number of loans in the total pool. So a smaller institution is going to have less opportunity to break their pools apart because they simply don't have enough loans to do that. So you want it to be at least statistically reasonable to have a couple hundred loans in a subpool. Also, again, if you don't have data that's risk characteristic data that is valid, it's going to be difficult to do a subpool. And as I mentioned, this is an example. If you don't risk rate all of your loans, risk rating may not be a good way to try to break the portfolio apart. Similarly, if you're a smaller institution and you make all of your loans risk rated 4 and only, basically upgrade cash secured to 1 and downgrade problem loans to 5s and 6s, it's not going to be very statistically valuable. Parenthetically, it's interesting, I know of some commercial lending larger banks that tend to put all of their loans in the most risky pass pool because they figure that's the most conservative way to go. Doing that actually penalizes you under CECL because now you've incorrectly assigned them all the same amount of risk. So an underlying thing here and a good best practice for credit risk management is to have a good multi-point risk rating scale. That'll allow you to do the kinds of analysis like CECL that are more effective. And that's what we're talking about here, is that it must be meaningful. So if you don't have good risk rating data, we've used other indicators of risk, like, for example, number of times delinquent. That's a risk indicator that most cores have. And you could, for example, bucket your subpools for cohort into number of times delinquent, non-delinquent, 0 to 30, and 30 to 59 and 59 and above, for example, would be another way you could do a risk-based bucketing. This is really up to the institution, and it's really up to also the quality of the data that you have to work with. One of the nice things about subpooling, and I mentioned a best practice of credit risk management of having good, well-dispersed risk ratings. Another is to be able to look within the pools of your ALLL to look for risk characteristics that could suggest potential issues. So subpooling is good for CECL. It's also good to help inform bank management of what's going on in the portfolio. You can look at loans that are due in the near term versus loans that are due later. You can look at those that have more risky characteristics. So it's a good practice all the way around, CECL notwithstanding. Now, everybody knows that part of CECL is the life of loan calculation. This is one of the difficult things institutions are coming to grips with of all sizes. How do you do that? Well, if you start with the basic idea that a life of loan is the contractual life, meaning that the term from origination date to contractual maturity date is the life of loan, that's just the start. Under the CECL rule, if you used the life of loan based on the letter of the law of the rule, you would break it into subpools, and then the longest term loan in any subpool would become the life of loan for that subpool. So in other words, if you have a vintage and you have 3 tenor bands, 1 to 3 years, 3 to 5, and 5 and up, and you have 1 3-year loan that actually lasts all 3 years in your pooling, then that would be the length of the life of loan. However, it's acceptable to use average life of loan. And at least that's our interpretation of what we're hearing based on the regulators, ask the regulators, that you can calculate an average life of loan so that if you have different payoff periods, prepayments, and the like, you can actually reduce the life of loan by averaging the life of loan in the subpools. But one of the keys to this is to create this actual life of loan, because right within the rule is the statement that you need to take into account things like prepayments, renewals, charge-offs, TDRs, and things that change the life of loan from the contractual age to actual. So you're really dealing with two concepts here. One is creating an actual life of loan, and the other is averaging those. So one way you can do this relatively easily, even without a system, would be to get your closed account information and compare that with the actual maturity dates at the time of origination. If you think about it, it's pretty basic. You're saying if it's a 3-year maturity, but it actually closed in 2 years for whatever reason, then the actual life of loan is 2. And this is something that is considered important in the calculation. And if you think about it, just intuitively, it reduces the life of loan. So if you don't have closed accounts, there are some banks who are looking at using their ALM prepayment percentage approximation as a way to create an adjusted life of loan for prepayments and charge-offs and the like. The problem with using the ALM prepayment percentage is it's usually an approximated number coming from an industry source. So it's going to be hard to justify that it necessarily applies to your specific portfolio. And second of all, the ALM pools, the asset breakdown may not be the same as your pooling for the CECL calculation. So it may not apply one-to-one. So there are some challenges going that way. Using the loan close date is obviously the preferred method, but can be complicated depending on the size of your portfolio. So in our experience, applying the actual life of loan reduces the ACL significantly. Using an average actual life of loan has a similar impact. So for example, here's a table to give you an idea of how it might work. These would be vintage lives of loans or lifespan. And you can see in the light blue, these are different pools, and then we've broken them into tenor bands, and in most cases, but not all, the average life of loan is significantly less than the total life of loan. So, and again, if you don't remember what total life of loan is, that would be the contractual lifespan and the longest term loan within that. So in the first example of 5 family, 5 plus up to 7 years, that would be where all the loans that had a contractual date between 1 and 7 years would go. All the loans that have a contractual term above 7 years would go into the second subpool. But when you take into account closed accounts, prepayments, renewals, and the like, you find that your average life of loan is really 1 year for the 5 plus up to 7 and 3 years for the greater than 7. So it does make a significant difference. And these are the lives of loans you're going to multiply times loss rates, and they're going to qualify losses to be included in the calculations. There's an example again of up to 5 years, but really an average life of 2. So, historical data. This was the thing, the drum that was banging right from the very beginning, was you really need a lot of this. And the question is, what do you need it for? What we've talked about is creating a life of loan. We've talked about creating subpools. The question is there a specific historical period that you need to use to base all of these calculations? And the answer is no. There is nothing in the rule that says this is the number of years you have to account for. What's said is that you should do the best you can, and what would be best would be if you had life of loan through an economic cycle, which could be 7 to 10 years. For most community banks, that's not within their reach. So what do you use it for, and how much do you need? As it turns out, this can be important in the calculation. Intuitively, you would think the more actual historical data I've got, the more accurate my life of loan is going to be. Right? I mean, that just seems to make sense because you've got more historical performance to reflect upon and use. But here's the irony. CECL is a forward-looking calculation. So you're not supposed to rely just on history. If you read the rule, it's history plus current conditions plus future conditions, and it's a mix. So how much history do you use, and how far back do you go? One consideration right away would be to say, if I think the economy in 2020 is going to be more like it was in 2006, why wouldn't I use the pattern of losses in 2006 and 7 as my projection, as opposed to looking at data that went back to 2003? These are things that are being looked at today. We're looking for opinions from accounting firms, regulators, as to a best practice on this, because it's very subjective in the actual rule. One of the problems we've found is again, somewhat counterintuitive, is that some institutions do have up to 15 years of loss information. You know, they've held them in spreadsheets, they've got them, they've even got balance information going back that far. So they can calculate loss rates potentially going back to 2006 or 2005. That can be problematic because of the fact of the way most community banks' portfolios performed based on the economic downturn in 2007, 8, 9, and 10. So this can create an anomalous bubble or boulder, in effect, in the road if you start to pull in loss history that goes so far back that includes sporadic losses during the economic downturn. The other thing that we found by actually working with these calculations is that if you have some of these early historical charge-offs in your data, they can actually create a ripple effect when you use the projections for remaining terms of vintage. And I'll show you how that would work. So one of the things we experimented with was, what if you shorten the data period? What if you don't include losses that go back further than, let's say, 2014? I mean, 2014 to 2020 is 6 years. That sounds like a pretty good period. But if you do that, you're going to reduce your ACL because you're not going to consider losses from those early periods. Conversely, we found if you are going to include those early periods, lengthening it even further is helpful because it allows you to average the loss over a longer period of time. Also, we found that using cohort or vintage has different effects on these early losses. Cohort, or the snapshot calculation, is going to pick up any loss in that cohort regardless of when the loan was originated. That means that even if the loan was originated in 2005 and you're using a base period of 2010, you're still going to get that loss if it shows up in 2010, 11, or 12. So if you had a lot of losses back in during the downturn, cohort's going to most likely cost you more when it comes to your calculation. Again, this is all observations based on what we've seen. This is not a recommendation that is approved by the regulators or auditors. Now, vintage only tracks losses that occur for loans in the original base pool, meaning when you pick your first vintage, the first period you have good data for your pool, that's where your history begins, and any losses that happen for loans that originated before that period are not included. So there is some advantage to using vintage if you have losses in that period. The real question, though, I think is, does it even make sense to do this? I can tell you that the American Bankers Association has written white papers saying you should not be trying to predict the future at all, and you should not be using historical information that may or may not be relevant to create your projections. I think that's open for discussion and interpretation, and certainly there are different views from different either regulatory bodies or members of the accounting community. Let me show you an example of a calculation, how it can be changed based on just historical data. So what I'm showing you here is a vintage calculation from our Argus product. And this is the classic stair-step model. You can see it. And what it's showing you is in the beige, you're seeing loss rates, which are calculated based on losses that occurred during these periods. And you can see across the top is the history, and down the left side are the actual origination periods. So this one starting is 3/31/2011. If you're confused by this, you notice that it goes from column A to G, because I moved it forward so you would be able to see the losses. Now, the green period here are life of loan origination periods that have not happened yet. Obviously, if you look at row 30, the last row is 3/31/2018. We haven't seen the entire life of loan for those 22 quarters. Hasn't happened yet. So under the vintage calculation, you have to project what those losses would be. And they have what's called a mean reversion. And if you look at it, they take a loss and then they divide it by the periods of the life of loan and then use that as a loss rate for the future. So in this example, in quarter 21, for loans that originated on 3/31/2011, there's a 758% loss rate. So it was a small pool at that point, had a large loss compared to the original balance. If you divide that by the remaining life of loan and create a reversion, you see a 10.15% loss rate perpetuated down for a great number of quarters. That's going to obviously multiply times the balance and give you a pretty large life of loan loss. Now, if what you do is say, I'm not going to start 3/31/2011, I'm going to start 3/31/2009. So I'm going to add, another 9 quarters. And what I'm doing now is I'm spreading that 758% loss over a wider period, more beige quarters. And that drives down the rate, the average rate, to 7.61. So you can see how that would have an impact. What is allowed and what is acceptable, we are told by the regulators and we are told by various industry groups that CECL is about creating the best estimate that you can support that is reasonable and justifiable, and explaining very well how you came up with those numbers. You can do that with this and say, what I did was I decided that I would use a longer period of time to incorporate losses, and it's totally reasonable to calculate a smaller rate because I considered a longer period of time in my history. You might not feel the same way if suddenly you picked up a bunch of losses in the early periods of 2009. Again, these are just illustrations to give you an idea of how best practices seem to be emerging. So I have the white alligator here because the white alligators are very rare, rarely seen, and usually somewhat dangerous. That's what we're finding about losses in our community bank portfolios. There are very few for a lot of banks, and they're usually highly concentrated during the economic downturn. And that causes a number of problems using these models. With vintage, because of the mean reversion, you'll have these spikes of losses that are replicated like I showed you. In cohort, the losses are averaged, but they include the sporadic losses that may have been in the pool and may have been originated a decade before by a totally different set of underwriting standards and a totally different set of management. So it's a struggle to decide what is appropriate to include and not include. Does it make sense to include these one-time economic based outliers, or is it better to say these are not relevant to the future of our portfolio, so we're not going to include them? What will the auditors accept? What we're seeing is this problem is not as significant for the larger institutions, as you can probably just intuitively think. Why larger institutions have a larger spread of losses, and so they have patterns that are more even, sprinkled throughout, so they don't have the volatility, they don't have these spikes that the community banks have. So they're not having the problems in their calculations that we are. It even begs the question, are the banks who are using longer historical data periods being penalized unfairly, and those that have fewer losses? It also makes one think about perhaps these calculations, because of these issues, aren't going to be used as the result, and instead they're going to be guidelines, and you're going to use Q factors to work your way to what you can really understand and manage. Reasonable, justifiable Q factors will be a lot of work to create, and they'll have to be supported. But more and more, based on the inadequacy of data to support models like vintage and cohort, we think Q factors are going to be much more important and will be something that will take up a lot of time and energy. We don't know what the auditors are going to say exactly about this, but that seems to be the way things are going. Another thing to think about is the impact of recoveries. Most community banks are maintaining their charge-offs on the core, or they have them in workbooks. They have the transactional data. Most of them can tie them back to pools. So you have a lot of loss information generally accessible. Some put their recovery data into the core, but most don't, to be honest. What we're finding is that some banks, particularly community banks, don't even record their recoveries anywhere. Instead of, they record them in the general ledger as a general ledger entry, but they don't have the transactional information to match back up necessarily to the charge-off, or they may not have it associated with any particular loan. And that's a problem because CECL does allow you to use net charge-offs. So if you had detailed recovery data and you brought that in with your loss data, you could significantly drive down your ACL rates. That's your reserve amounts under CECL. So this is something that's important, particularly when you think about the fact that some of these outliers could be mitigated by recovery that happens later on in the cohort or the vintage pool. It's very important. So banks really need to make sure they include recovery information if it's at all possible. That way, you'll have a much more stable calculation. So that's sort of an in-depth look for the last half an hour or so at some of these best practices that are emerging. I'm going to kind of recap them for you, but I am going to give you this caveat, which is these are observations that we have from looking at actual community bank data being run through these calculations. We would suggest that if you're going to create a calculation, number one, you understand it completely so that you can represent it to your board, your management, and your regulators and auditors. And that if you are going to make adjustments like shorter or longer periods or averages or anything else, that it's properly justified and you can explain it to the regulators. Relying on vendors to support you in that is probably not going to work very well because it is the bank's risk. So we think what you should do is test these things out, figure out what works best for the institution, and test your internal, external auditors and other authorities before coming up with your final methodology. As we do more testing, we know more best practices will surface, and I'll be happy to share them with the industry as we are now. So to recap, if you're using an asset-based or call code collective impairment pools, consider using risk-based subpools to break out the losses into more logical and justifiable buckets that are risk-based. Consider the fact that you don't want to have one pool with 10 loans and one with 200, that you want to try to make distributions reasonable. Number two, create an actual life of loan using the close date versus the actual contractual date for the loan term, and use that as your adjustment factor when you're doing a life of loan calculation. If you don't have the close dates available to you for all of your loans in history through the core, you could possibly use ALM prepayment rates. Understanding limitations. Consider using an aggregate average life of loan for each subpool. That will shorten the life of loan lifespan because it will take into account recoveries as well as prepayments and other events. Consider tailoring the amount of historical data included in your loss modeling effort. So what we thought, perhaps in the beginning, which was, the more the better, as hopefully you saw in what I was showing you in the examples, that's not always the case. Sometimes having a long period is going to include losses and artificially inflate your loss rates. However, sometimes making it even longer will be better because it'll actually allow you to do a division average that will lower the total rate. Again, if you listen to some of the industry groups like the American Bankers Association, what they're saying is, look at where you are in the lifespan of the credit cycle and peg your losses to what you believe is your position in that cycle versus the future. That would be something you'd have to justify. It would not necessarily match your historical loss history. So it could be somewhat tricky, and we don't know if that's acceptable or not, but those are some of the ideas that are emerging. If at all possible, incorporate recoveries. Recoveries can actually drive down the loss amounts. Again, if you're going to try to use vintage, consider using reversion method. I didn't mention this, but for those of you who are real CECL geeks, the vintage model does allow you to use a different method for projecting the future periods, and that is what's called mirroring. The logic being that the loss curve is sort of like a bell or an army helmet or whatever you want to call it, where there's very few losses in the beginning and very few losses at the tail, but a whole lot of losses in the middle. If you use mirroring and you do have some losses in the beginning, then those losses will come back in the tail, so it's not recommended. And again, we talked about possibly adjusting your lifespan of your subpools under vintage to make them longer, but consider that you might be picking up losses from some historical periods that are not analogous to the future. So one of the best practices that we are trying to follow and understand, and probably a good summation to what we've learned, is that we may be saying, let's do these calculations and let's try these different methods and the different things you can change. But let's use that as a base, not necessarily as the result, and Q-factor your way to a more correct and justifiable result for your institutions. Coming up soon will be best practices in how we do that. Q factors that have maybe some quantitative support and justification. Does create a kind of a circular logic where you're creating qualitative factors backed by quantitative factors. But that's what we're learning about CECL. So just as putting this all in context, where are we now as we are moving through 2019? If you're a public business entity, you probably know this already. If you don't, you better find out, because you're going to start doing your CECL calculation in March of 2020. If you're one of those unusual but non-PBEs, non-public business entities, but you are an SEC filer, you're a 2021. And obviously, if you're a non-PBE, non-SEC filer, you're a 2022 bank. So there's three paths that you could be taking. There's obviously different functions and steps along the path. Depending on where you are, you could be still looking at alternatives if you're not going live until 2022, or you could be looking at actually running parallel at this point if you're a public business entity. One other thing to think about is when's your fiscal year end, because one of the things we've learned is that if your fiscal year end is September, because of the way CECL is written, you probably don't have to do your calculation until the following December. Again, check with your audit firms. Do not take what I say for gospel. We see a little square that popped up here at the end, a two-step transition. There's been some discussion in some of the Ask the Regulator webinars that smaller community banks could maybe start with a very simple calculation, again, harkening back to the weighted average maturity method, but that they need to transition over time to a more sophisticated risk-based method. I can tell you Ardmore does not support the idea of doing this twice. It seems to make more sense to do it once and do it right. But again, it's if the institution decide the best way to proceed down the path. Another thing to think about, and I leave you with this idea as well, which is you need to have a formal CECL plan. I think a lot of banks think that, well, we'll just kind of have a CECL committee and we'll talk about it, and then, we'll buy a vendor software package and then we'll be done. That's not going to be very acceptable to your regulators as they go through your safety and soundness exams. You're going to need to be able to explain how you're going to get from 2019 to 2022 if you're a 2022 bank. You're already being asked about it, obviously, if you're a public business entity. There's an expectation that you're doing parallel now. If you're not, then I think you're going to have some problems if you get a visit from them. So having a plan is very helpful. And when you're building your project plan, again, assuming you're going to 2022, meaning you can start from really scratch, is you can sort of look at it backwards and say, okay, I need to be compliant March 2022. And I know where I am now. And then we saw the results in the poll. How do you get from planning or data remediation to where I need to be? So I just threw out some milestones here for a CECL project plan. These are some things that you would consider doing. Again, you probably should be near the end of this plan if you are a 2020 bank. If you're a 2022 bank, you might be the beginning of this plan. But there's some big decisions being made. You can lay these out against a multi-year timeline, assuming you have that far. But make sure you leave some time at the end to run parallel or simultaneous, because the only way you can really learn, and I think that's one of the main learning points from this discussion we've had today, the only way you can really learn is to run your data through the pools and see how it comes out. Until you do that, you're only working with theory. Once you see the results and say, whoa, this is not what I expected, or, I think we can do better than this, that's when you start realizing that you need to do adjustments, like we just discussed in the bulk of this webinar. That adjustment might be changing the way you calculate the life of loan, creating different subpools, considering different historical periods, looking at historical loss projections differently. I think these are all things that you want to consider, and the only way to really do it is to take your portfolio and run them through the mill. Now, what I'd like to do now is another poll with you. This will be the last poll of the day if you guys are getting tired of being polled. But we always like to get a sense of what the concerns are of our bank. So the poll you're going to see on your screen now really is one of these where you can check off as many as apply to your institution. And again, I appreciate you participating. The question is, what are your biggest concerns about CECL at this point? Knowing what you know, doing what you've done, realizing where you are in the cycle. Check as many as you think are appropriate about what your major concerns are. I think this kind of information is important for the industry to understand. If the biggest concern we have is about data, then again, we should spend more time talking about how we can improve that with peer data or other sources. But if the biggest concern is really about simply trying to teach your board what CECL is, then that's a different kind of education and resource set that you can get. I can mention while we're finishing this up that I have the good fortune of being able to speak at the RMA conference this fall in New Orleans, talking about more of this, more hands-on results of CECL for community banks. So hopefully you're a member of RMA and you're going, and if so, please drop by and say hi, because I'll also be taking questions there and the like. Okay, well, I think most of the people have voted, so we're going to shut this down and show you the results of what people are concerned about. So this is not surprising. People are concerned about the cost of CECL, using outside resources and what that's going to cost, and finding the time to do it internally if you're going to try to do it that way. Other than that, you can see there are people who are concerned about other issues as well. Most understand what they're supposed to do. And it's interesting here that people are saying they're not as concerned about their data supporting it. That was probably one of the biggest concerns that we used to see in the early CECL polls. All right, so where do we go from here? Happy to take a couple of minutes, and then I'll take a couple of questions if you have them. Ardmore and Argus can help your institution. A couple of things that we do. Matt mentioned this before. We do a credit data assessment service, CECL readiness assessment, and we've done this for probably 20 or 25 community banks in the last couple of years, where we look at your origination process, the data you're gathering, how much history you have, your charge-off, all that stuff. We look at that, and then we give you a report telling you where your gaps are and what you need to do for CECL. So that's a service we perform has been very successful, and our banks find it brings a lot of value. So if you're interested in that sort of thing, please reach out. We also support the Argus software, which I mentioned before, and then the way that works is we hook up to your core. We get a monthly transmission of data. We give you the data fields that we need. It goes into a data mart. In that data mart, which is dedicated to you, Ardmore first does the assessment, so we can tell you whether or not we think you're ready to go or whether you need more information. And then the way we engineered this solution is we have one for 2022 banks and one for banks going live right away. The 2022 banks, we have a boot camp. If you join the boot camp, it's a lower cost of entry. You get your data is archived, and we do the data assessment, but also you have an interactive forum where you can talk about CECL, ask questions, have access to resources, white papers, and you also get reports about the credit quality of your data, so that if you are undergoing a data remediation effort, you'll be able to track that through the monthly reports as well. So the boot camp is for banks that want to start collecting the data right away, would like the data assessment, would like access to good resources, but don't feel they need a full software solution at this point. If you want a full solution, we obviously have that with our Argus CPM, or Credit Portfolio Management System, where you can have the full CECL calculation. You can also set up your current ALLL if you still want to run parallel, and it does all of the reporting, all the analytics, all the information that we're showing you. Just to give you an idea of what that looks like, it's a dashboard type focused solution with workflow. You can see here's a dashboard for an analyst who's looking at their pools, their individual evaluations and TDRs. Once the cycle starts, there's a review process where you can manage this information, get it correct, then you do the calculation and close the cycle. We support vintage, as you saw in the example in the webinar, cohort or snapshot. We also have the weighted average remaining maturity method, and we also support PDLGD. So as best practices emerge, you're not forced to just stay with one method. You can also, this allows you to test the different methods. Our 2020 banks are doing that now. Here's an example of a report, an actual bank that we're working with, that shows for one pool, 7 different scenarios that they've tried and the impact on the ACL and the loss rates that have been created. So just to give you an idea. For those of you who are wondering, like, what's the impact? We've seen some banks very small impacts. In fact, even an improvement. If you think about it, right now, probably 70% of most banks' ALLL is based on their Q factors. There have been so few losses during your look-back period that you've had to add Q factors. So if 70% of your reserve is Q factor, CECL is only going to impact 30% of your reserve. So even if it were to, add 50%, it would still be not so significant to ruin your budget necessarily. So it really varies on the way your portfolio is put together and how much are in your Q factors to actually get to a bottom line number that can show you the impact. Other reports that we have obviously detailed Q factors that you can put drivers underneath them to create a more quantitative, qualitative Q factor. We have economic indicators, particularly in vintage, because of the fact that it's used on specific loans that were originated at a specific time. You can use that to help justify replacing one of the Q factors that you might have to create manually. And we do have full economic indicator reports, closure reports, disclosures, all the stuff that if you have to do by hand, including some of the things like calculating the life of loan, the average life, and the adjusted quarters. And even attribution reports that look at how did the portfolio change quarter to quarter, and how is it reflected in reports. So that's what I had to share with you today. We have about 5 minutes left on our time period, and I'm going to check to see, Matt, if there are any questions that have been posed. And if you have a question, you can enter it in the question box on the right side. So one question we have here is about, is it true that Congress is going to make CECL not happen? Well, it is true that some members of Congress have put together bills that would, in theory, stop CECL based on the concept that CECL could actually harm, particularly community banks, by making money particularly tight during an economic downturn. As in other words, if you project losses and you want to shift capital into the ALLL, then obviously that would have an impact on the bottom line of your bank. It would also make it difficult under CECL to lend to subprime because they'd be so risky, as well as other more risky credits and longer term securities. So that's the logic for saying that it's not right and it should be stopped until that's fully understood. However, it's my opinion that that's not going to happen in time for the 2020 banks. And by 2022, all these things will be worked out one way or the other, or at least further down the road. I don't think most members of Congress are going to want to be associated with signing a bill to stop progress in something that both the PCAOB, the accounting world, and the regulators want. So it may someday come to a vote, but I think it's very unlikely. So if you're counting on the legislature to bail you out, that's probably not a good idea. I don't see any other questions right now. If you do have a question, feel free to contact me. My contact information is up on the screen. And if you'd like more information about our CECL solutions, either the credit data assessment or the Argus CPM suite or the boot camp, drop me an email or give me a call and I'd be happy to do a demo as well. So thank you very much for your time. Appreciate it. Hopefully this was useful. I love your feedback. And if you're interested in further information along this line as we go through our CECL journey. By the end of the summer, I think we'll have even more information and we'll do a similar thing. So thanks again for Ardmore, and thanks personally for your attention.